Paddle releases don't ever really stop these days, but we are going to take a little break from the reviewing to reflect on everything that's come out this year for our year-end Pickleball Paddle Awards. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. Strap in for a fun ride. It might get a little controversial. I'm ready for the heat, so please don't hesitate to let me know in the comments section if you think I'm dead wrong about something. I'm gonna set some criteria here in a second because there are some important things you need to keep in mind while watching this video. But before we get into any of that, let me remind you, as usual, that any of the paddles we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So let's talk about the criteria these paddles need to fulfill to make it on the list, because I'm sure some of you are going to be thinking, why isn't my paddle here? And it could very well have something to do with what I'm about to say. For one, we have to carry the paddle. I know this kind of goes without saying, but we don't carry every paddle in the world, and I can only talk about the ones we have. Two, to be eligible for a 2024 paddle award, the paddle must have come into the store in 2024. Not necessarily released in 2024, but I can't have already talked about it last year. There are a couple of important paddles that we tested last year that could definitely be in the running for these awards, but there's so many paddles nowadays that I kind of had to narrow down the list somehow, and that seemed pretty logical to me. Finally, I do just want to remind you that while I do try to be as objective as possible in my videos, especially ones like this, there is bound to be a bit of personal bias, so just keep that in mind. But anyways, we're going to hand out a lot of awards today. The best power paddle, best control paddle, best spin paddle, the most well-rounded paddle, the best value, and of course, we'll finish up with the best overall paddle of the year. Without further ado, let's talk about the best power paddle. I think we can all agree that 2024 has been the year of the power paddle, but I think we can also agree that it hasn't always been smooth sailing, especially with foam paddles. Companies started experimenting with foam as a core material because foam adds a unique spring effect onto the ball, which exponentially amplifies power. The first foam paddle I tested was the Gearbox Pro Power Elongated, which I know technically came out last year, but we didn't get it until January. But anyways, I was completely blown away by that paddle's power. It was really unlike anything I'd ever tried before. Other paddles seem to soak up the ball's energy during dwell time, even other powerful paddles, but the Gearboxes added energy onto the ball. Later on in the year, Gearbox released their Pro Ultimate Power, which is also extremely powerful, but just a little more controlled with its thicker core. Then the Gen 3 Yolas came out, and with them started the most controversial event in pickleball history. The paddles were initially approved by USAPA, but then eventually delisted for being too powerful, which opened up a Pandora's box of issues. Thousands of customers were left with paddles they couldn't use in sanctioned tournaments. Luckily, Yola took them back and started working on paddles that were actually legal. A few months later, they released their Pro Edition Mod TAs, and then eventually the Yola 3S series. Now, I've tested both, and I can promise you they are virtually identical to the Gen 3s that were delisted. So long story short, super bizarre situation, but you can now sort of buy a legal foam paddle from Yola, so I'm considering both the Mod TA and the 3S series eligible for this one. We also have to throw Paddle Tech into the mix with their very powerful ALW and TKO lines. These don't have foam in them, but also add a really strong amount of pop and power onto the ball, although not quite as much as foam paddles. So in terms of hyper-powerful paddles, you've got the Paddle Techs, Yolas, and Gearboxes, all of which would have been worthy winners, but none of them are taking home this award. That's going to the Rhombus Ripple. Now, part of me really didn't want to give this to the Ripple because it's also going through its own bit of controversy right now, but I can't pretend like the Ripple I tested back in September doesn't exist. The power on that paddle was similar to the Yolas and Gearboxes, maybe actually a touch lower, but its control and spin were a clear notch ahead of those, making its overall performance significantly better. Really, this should have been the easiest award to hand out this year, but now it seems like Rhombus are calling the one I tested the beta, and they're changing the full release version that's supposed to come out on December 6th. And as of today, they've actually delayed that one even further. I haven't actually tested the new one, but from all the rumors I've heard, it does sound like that one is unfortunately going to play different, so this may not apply to the new one. Still, what Rhombus showed they could do with the Beta Ripple is beyond impressive for me. I said it in the review that it was the coolest paddle I'd ever tested, and I maintain that. So it's the best power paddle of the year, and if you can get your hands on one, I highly recommend it. We do have quite a few of them left, and just for your own peace of mind, if you do have to warranty a Beta Ripple, Rhombus has said they'll cover it with the full release version when it does come out. Now we're going to move on to the other side of the pickleball playability spectrum with control. Control paddles made a bit of a comeback this year after a pretty dry 2023 with all the stiff thermoform paddles we got last year. That comeback really started with the introduction of Kevlar as a top sheet material. Kevlar provides a more flexible feel on contact than carbon, especially on soft shots, which increases dwell time and therefore control. We saw a ton of Kevlar paddles come into the store this year, like the 6-0 Ruby, the Honolulu Pickleball J2K and J3K, and the Bread and Butter Fat Boy. They became an instant hit because of their dynamic playability, especially their soft game performance, and what eventually happened is that companies who weren't using Kevlar had to figure out other ways to soften up their thermoform paddles. Brands started creating unique core constructions and carbon layups to increase that dwell time. One of my personal favorites is Rhombus's carbon grid technology that we first saw introduced on the Novas last year. On those paddles, they only use that grid pattern on the edges. This year they released the Pulsar FXs that feature the carbon grid all over the face, which made them truly elite soft control paddles. Selkirk also finally upped their game with a raw carbon thermoform paddle, first releasing the Vanguard controls, which were good but not quite as soft as some of the industry-leading softer thermoform paddles like the Pulsar FXs I just mentioned. They built off of those and released the Vanguard Pro Invicta and Epic, which feature a uniquely woven carbon top sheet with 4 layers of carbon, and those are much softer than the Vanguard controls while also being a level above in spin and power. One company took control to the next level though, Pickleball Apes. They decided to combine a Kevlar top sheet with a softer core design to create the ultimate control paddle, and suffice to say, they succeeded. Their Pulse paddles are some of the softest thermoformed Kevlar paddles that you can find, and they also have really large forgiving sweet spots and muted feels, which makes their control profile even better. The Pulse E and Pulse S are elite control paddles, but the Pulse V is going to take the award for the best control paddle of 2024. It's a wide body paddle, so it has an even bigger sweet spot, which makes it even more forgiving in the control game if you need that. Now this award is probably the most subjective of all the ones I'm giving out today, just because I do think muted and a big sweet spot are generally better for control, but not everyone likes that. Personally, I prefer something with a bit more connection to the ball, but I think the Pulse V is the control paddle that will work for the most amount of people, which is why I have it coming in first place here. I also want to say that there are some paddles that came out this year that are a little bit softer and more forgiving than this one, like the Bread and Butter Fat Boy, but the Pulse V is still elite for control while being significantly more well-rounded than those paddles, and I think that's an important thing in pickleball nowadays. In a perfect world, I'd give the Best Spin Paddle of the Year award to the Rhombus Ripple, because if you watched our review, I describe it as the paddle that gives you the most control over the amount of spin you put on the ball. Not only is it extremely spin-friendly, but spin modulation is very high, because you never lose the ball in the paddle face, which is a little different to the sensation I get on other foam paddles. The problem is, it sounds like the Beta's spin profile may be what changes the most with the full release, so the Beta is fantastic, but I am going to give this award to another paddle this year. The reality is, every foam paddle is top tier for spin, because it doesn't just help to amplify power, it also creates this very responsive backboard for spin generation, kind of like strings in a tennis racket. So we go back to the foam paddles that were in the running for the Power Awards, the Gearbox Pro Powers, Ultimates, and Controls, the Yola Mod TAs, and then the Yola 3S paddles. Like I said, they're all top tier, but for me, the Yola Hyperion 3S stands out as the best amongst all of them for a couple of reasons, a major one being they're just more readily available than the limited Mod TAs. The other thing to factor in is the Hyperion's shape. The Perseus, the Mods, and even the Gearbox paddles all have that standard elongated design. The Hyperion is shaped more aerodynamically, so it can be swung quicker to generate spin. Of course, this is a really small difference, and some of you may actually feel like the standard paddles generate more spin because they provide a tiny bit more leverage over the ball, but I find that the boost in paddle speed is just a little bit better in the spin game, especially for spin variety. I also have to say, I've always found Yola's propulsion core to be a little more effective than Gearbox's at transferring spin into the ball, which is another reason I've got the Hyperion 3S ahead of those. But yeah, an incredible year for spin in pickleball. These foam paddles are a notch ahead of standard paddles in terms of spin generation, but those also saw a huge boost, especially Kevlar paddles. So basically brands are just pushing spin to the next level, which is awesome. This is a category I didn't give an award to last year, but with the sheer amount of amazing all-court paddles that came out this year, we have to address it. In fact, this might be the most prestigious award of the bunch. Well-rounded playability goes hand in hand with what I said in the control section. A lot of the R&D this year was aimed at improving control on thermoform paddles. Kevlar, the unique core constructions, and the carbon layups have all accomplished this, But for me, Kevlar is the best at improving control while still maintaining top tier power and spin, which is the key for all court playability. So I am going to have a Kevlar paddle win this award, but I also want to talk about paddle shape here because it is so important when discussing well-rounded playability. Elongated paddles provide more leverage for power, spin, and stability, while standard paddles are shorter and wider, so they're more maneuverable, forgiving, and controlled. Hybrid paddles lie somewhere in between the two, basically providing the best of both worlds. You probably get where I'm going with this. Hybrid paddles are perfect if you're looking for well-rounded playability. So add two and two together, Kevlar plus hybrid. There were a few very good Kevlar hybrid paddles that came into the store this year, most notably the 6-0 Ruby and Honolulu Pickleball J2K. They are admittedly very similar, but they do have a slightly different shape. The J2K's bottom portion of the paddle face comes down a little bit lower and it's a little wider, which makes the sweet spot bigger and therefore more forgiving. It's a very minimal difference, but to me it's exactly the tiebreaker I need to say that the J2K is that little bit more well-rounded than the Ruby. It's just a little easier to use and accessible to a wider player base, but both are obviously fantastic all-court paddles. There's really no area where the J2K isn't excellent. Spin is top tier, control is fantastic, especially if you appreciate good feel, and power is never going to be as high as foam paddles, but it's up there with the best of the rest. With all the technological developments in recent years, it's pretty logical that after the initial R&D investment, certain companies would be able to produce paddles with high quality technology at a much cheaper price. We saw a ton of good value paddles this year, but one has stood out to me as a clear notch ahead of the rest: the Neonic Flow. This isn't a paddle I've individually reviewed on this channel, and I probably won't at this point, but for 180 Canadian dollars, I know it's not cheap, but its playability is fantastic. It's a Toray T700 raw carbon thermoform paddle, and most of the paddles with similar tech specs are coming in well over that $200 price point. The Flow is a proper high quality thermoform paddle too. It's got that premium rigid feel with a ton of spin and really good power, but unlike the original Gen 2 thermoform paddles that were really all out power and not much else, the control is really solid here. It's not as soft as Kevlar paddles or those dynamic paddles I keep referring to, but you can definitely feel a little more dwell time here than on something like the carbon power paddles, for example. That also makes it perform a little better in the spin game because you can use that extra dwell time to grab and shape the ball. I also love this shape. It's the same length as paddles like the J2K and the Ruby, but it's actually a little bit whippier because this face doesn't come down as low or flare out as much. That helps with spin, although it does make the sweet spot a little bit smaller too. I really can't think of a better paddle under $200, at least if we're talking retail prices, although I have to say, I think the Flow is fantastic without even talking about the price. But anyways, now let's move on to the best overall paddle of 2024. Again, because of all the controversy surrounding it, I really didn't want to give it to this paddle, but honestly, I've never played with anything this good. The best paddle of 2024 is the Rhombus Ripple Beta. I was so taken aback by this paddle's performance when I first tested it because it was really beyond what I had imagined was possible, and it's more than just its obscene power and spin potential. Coming from a tennis background, I've been looking for a paddle that allows me to manipulate a pickleball in the same way that I can a tennis ball, and up until I tested the Ripple, no paddle was nearly as responsive as a racket. At some point, you tell yourself, okay, well, they're different sports, you're just never gonna get that same feeling in pickleball and adopt your technique accordingly. But then I played with this paddle, and that's exactly what they accomplished. I was hitting so much more spin and power, but I also had a significantly better feel for the ball, even compared to other foam paddles. That gave me a level of consistency and confidence that made the high power so easy to control. Now, it's not without its flaws. While I do think that feel is incredible, it does take quite a bit of skill to master it, and if you don't feel confident with this paddle, it's going to be way too powerful because of the foam. For those of you who can control it though, it's a highly addictive paddle that also performs the part, which is why it's easily the best paddle I tested this year. Time will tell as to whether the full release is as good as the beta. It obviously has some very big shoes to fill, but even if it's 90% as good, it would still be clear winner for Paddle of the Year for me. I also know that giving this paddle Paddle of the Year is maybe a little bit controversial, but it's legal, it's available at the store, so I gotta do it. But if I am going to give it to a paddle that doesn't have all this controversy surrounding it, so basically not a foam paddle, I'll give it to the Honolulu Pickleball J2K. I already said enough good things about it, but it's one of those paddles that's so well-rounded it can pretty much be used by any type of player at any level. I was very close to switching to it actually, but foam literally just hits different, so I have to go with one of those. That's going to wrap up the Paddle Awards for 2024. It's been another crazy year. Hopefully we have fewer controversies in 2025, but I also want them to keep pushing the needle, so I guess that that kind of comes with the territory. With that said, that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. And remember that if you want to demo any of the paddles I talked about here today, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.